Dear Shyam, I will not let the audience wait any longer to hear what you as an expert all have to say about this. We're very happy and honored to have you here today. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carolyn, for that introduction. Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to be the keynote speaker at this symposium and to share with you my thoughts on trust in AI. And unlike some of you who are coming from disciplines like philosophy and sociology and law, I'm more of a psychologist, and so my perspective will be from a micro level, like Carolyn already kind of previewed. And I also, I'm situated in a media school, so a lot of the examples I use will be AI in the context of media. So with that introduction, let me dive into my presentation. And hopefully you can see my screen in a second. Are you all able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. All right, so like I said, I'm going to talk about the psychology of human agency and how it comes in contact with machine agency in the age of artificial intelligence. And I'd like to take us back to the turn of the century first, to even how human agency came to be. I think the arrival of interactive media around the turn of the century created a fundamental shift in communication, where previously communication was very linear from source to receiver through a medium, and it was almost a unidirectional fashion. But then increasingly interactive media made it possible for the receivers themselves to be the source of communication, where you and I could customize our environments, we could choose what we wanted to consume, and also to increasingly kind of broadcast what we think and so forth. So there's enormous self-agency that's afforded by interactive media, especially by social media, where you can hold forth on your opinions, write, comment, recommend. You have your own little platform, a pulpit, if you will, from where you can express your agency. You can be a relevant source, which before the arrival of these kinds of media was the privilege of just a few journalists and editors who had the hold of mass media channels, who were in charge of newspapers and television stations, radio stations. But now everybody can be a broadcaster. So a few years ago, back in 2008, I came up with this model of community customization called the agency model of customization, which basically argues that we are able to assert ourselves as a source of communication by using the affordances of media like interactivity, modality, and navigability. These affordances enable each and every one of us to be unique sources of content that we experience. And what that does is it makes us become more involved and thereby affect our cognition. It also is a way to show our identity, and that has impact on our affect or attitudes. And then it also gives us more control over our information environment, which affects our behaviors. So all of this is made possible because we can customize our profile, we can go and comment on things, we can write our own blog posts or tweet and things like that. So this kind of customization activity is made possible by interactive media that's multimodal and highly navigable. However, customization is a lot of work. When you think about it like a psychologist, humans are creatures of convenience. We are cognitive misers. We outsource tasks as much as possible. We'd rather not do any work if we can avoid it. That's kind of the psyche of our social cognition. So wouldn't it be better if the system did the tailoring for us? Wouldn't it be more convenient if the system did the customization for us? And this is what we now know of as personalization. So personalization is something that came out of a necessity for tailoring our information environment that is a little bit more automated than we having to do all the work ourselves. And you've seen in the last 20 or so years a number of applications, with Google search engine being the basic one that personalizes your search. No two people's search outcomes are the same, even though you might enter the same keyword. Netflix, as we all know, recommends movies based on what other movies we've watched and that we've liked. And so personalization is one of the most dominant ways in which AI has manifested in the media space. And so what I began to do is contrast customization with personalization. In customization, the user tailors content for yourself. In personalization, the system figures out what is best for you and kind of tailors content for the individual users. And the model that I mentioned before, agency model of customization, would predict that when you do it yourself, you have greater agency and therefore more positive attitudes toward content, and also be able to express your identity and so forth. And so if you look at a Google Next website without any manipulation, it will just look like this with the top stories of the day. But if it is, has a personalized algorithm, then it'll have a for you section where basically these are stories picked for you based on your interest and your prior browsing behavior and so forth. So this kind of contrasting of customization and personalization is become part of our daily media lives, where on the one hand you can choose, you can customize with your topics, you can choose which topics you're interested in, what kinds of stories you want to be given on a daily basis. But on the other hand, the system can also proactively figure out what you might like and don't like. So we try to examine the differences between these two and try to see which one people would like more. Is it customization or personalization? And we found that indeed customization was preferred over personalization, and people rated the content quality to be higher, but only for people who are power users. Power users are people who are technologically savvy. They know how to use devices. They're the ones who are kind of opinion leaders on technology. But non-power users, the layperson users, which may be the majority, they prefer personalization to customization. They prefer that the system do all the work rather than they having to tinker with the settings. So as you can see, based on individual differences, you're finding a different pattern. But why? Why do non-power users prefer personalization for the system to do the work? Could it be maybe convenience? And why do power users prefer to customize on their own, tailor the environment on their own? Maybe they like more control. Power users, want to control their environment. But also around 2010, when we did these set of studies, we also began to see rising awareness of privacy concerns. And we wondered if privacy concern was underlying this tendency to kind of take over the tailoring for themselves by power users. And there's a lot of survey research, and you might have seen this, that roughly 7 in 10 Americans think that all or most of what they do online is tracked by companies. And also about half say that the government tracks them. And relatively few Americans think that they personally benefit a lot from the data that the companies and the government collect about them. And we hear stories all the time in the popular media about how smart speakers might be listening to us and then providing you surprisingly the thing that you were talking to your spouse about. You see an ad for that product on your newsfeed when you go to Facebook and so on. So we did a follow-up study where we had a simple privacy manipulation where we said either this news website will not use your browsing information and will not share your aggregated information with third parties outside the company. That was the high privacy condition. Or we said the website might use your browsing information and may share some of the aggregated, non-personal information. So this is kind of the low privacy manipulation. And so we found that effect that we saw in the previous study, we found that effect such that power users preferred customization over personalization, and non-power users preferred personalization over customization only under conditions of low privacy. When privacy was high, power users did not mind personalization. They did not mind the system doing it for them. And you can see that as in the high privacy condition, as power usage goes up, sense of control and sense of convenience both go up, regardless of whether it's customization or personalization condition that we are in. But for low privacy, you see that for customization, as if you're a power user, then you perceive more control and convenience. But when the system does it for you, for personalization, if you're a high power user, you feel like you don't have that much control and convenience. So in a way, when the system tailors information for you, power users especially are seeing that some of their control is lost. And so this brought in my mind this profound realization that people, especially power users, are fighting for their agency when they interact with these systems, often not fully knowing exactly how the systems make sense of their communication behaviors. And so, customization, when you do it yourself, it affords a sense of identity, it affords your ability to convey your identity, and you can control your behaviors. But personalization seems to take that away. And that's why users want to kind of, assert their autonomy by preferring customization over personalization and tend to take their privacy into their own hands. But it's not, open and shut case. It's not a black and white type issue. There is a bit of trust as well, in addition to this distrust. And if you look at some of the data that people say, when advertisers track people and surprise you with offerings, about half the people say that it helps me discover, more things that interest. But on the other hand, 44% of the people feel that it feels invasive, that it might intrude into their privacy. And overwhelmingly, internet users widely distrust Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram, and those kinds of platforms that rely heavily on advertising support to kind of give them the personalized content. And so there's this idea that Google and others are really kind of watching over your, surveilling every bit of information that passes on through your screens, especially your smartphones, which is kind of the hub of most of your activities. And so over the years, in the last 10 years or so, designers, human-computer interaction scholars and designers have come up with strategies to kind of overcome or combat some of these privacy concerns. So instead of covertly personalizing and pushing products directly onto consumers, there is emerged practice of overt personalization, where the app will tell you that maybe they can find something of value to the user in their surroundings. If you're walking on a street where there's a cafe, it kind of notices your location, but then doesn't give you the cafe ad or give you a coupon for the cafe. Instead, it'll ask you, I noticed that you're next to a Starbucks. Would you be interested in a $2 coupon for coffee? And then that way the user can make use of it if he or she so wishes. And so in this way, this is a little bit more transparent. There's a little bit more consultation. And also, there have been efforts in the industry to kind of minimize the amount of data that it collects about you and kind of makes sure that the data about you are ephemeral. That means that they disappear after a while. So these notions of information transparency have become very standard in the discourse on AI, especially how these systems collect information, how they store information, how they use your information, and also how they remove your information. And some of our studies have shown that the greater the information transparency, greater the trust, and lower the privacy concern. You can see this is a negative relationship here. And that trust can, in fact, engage users and also make them get involved in the product even more. And overt personalization, when the system tells you that it's personalizing, instead of kind of surprising you, it gives users the sense. And that is, in essence, this whole shift toward human agency, giving humans some agency. We have come from an era when we used to use hammers, where the entire agency rested with humans, to now, self-driving cars and, mobile apps that pretty much tell you what to do. They assume a lot of agency. Siri tells you what to do, and your smartwatches tell you to get up and go get some exercise. And so these kinds of devices have, over the years kind of created a tension between machines having agency and humans having agency, and thus necessitating a need for collaboration, more of a collaboration with technologies. And some of the strategies that I discussed, like overt personalization, is really kind of involving the user in that interaction. And for me, kind of the most telling example of a happy collaboration is car navigation systems, where pretty much we've given up on this notion of maps. We've given up any idea of directions. When we go to a new city, we don't even know if we are in the north or south very often. We just rely on our car navigator to kind of take us wherever we want to go. And that's a very happy collaboration, I feel. On balance, I think it works for most people most of the time. And for me, that kind of signifies the height of this agency negotiation, this idea that we perceive these intelligent technology as agents, and then we also have a say in this interaction, in this communication. We are communicating with these machines that are serving us, and so technologies that afford human agency without the negative consequences of privacy intrusion would be the ideal. And so some of these strategies involve deploying machines to enhance human agency, like I said, about having more of a reactive personalization rather than proactive personalization. Reactive is kind of like the overt personalization, proactive is more like the covert, and then increasing transparency of machine operations, like I was telling you earlier. And also a strategy would be to make it very clear for the user how their input is aiding the collection of user data, instead of it being ambient around you and you don't know what about you is being monitored or surveilled. So that's another popular strategy. A third strategy is to actually have alerts and warnings about different things that the user might be getting into. So for example, we often go to e-commerce websites, and if a lot of people like a product, we then trust that product. But we could have warnings that might tell us, look, these could be, these number of likes could be artificially inflated by the use of bots. In fact, you might know that in the last big election scandal we had in 2016, there were all these accusations, at least about the American elections, of Twitter bots kind of seeding social media feeds with a lot of, followers and likes and so forth, and artificially inflating the popularity of certain opinions. And so this can be easily kind of manipulated, these kinds of metrics, and they may not be as authentic as people think. And so we could use machines to alert users about these kinds of automated metrics that may not be authentic. Another strategy would be to actually leverage the tools of machine learning to overcome human cognitive deficits. We are awash in fake news now, to a point where it's impossible for human cognitive ability to keep up with all the fake news or to personally verify every piece of fake news. So there's a need now for using, clever algorithms that can detect fake news and kind of alert users. And we were among the first to get a grant, a National Science Foundation grant, back in 2017 to come up with algorithms to detect fake news. So just to kind of get to this place, the place that you see in these images of a self-driving car where you trust the car so much that you take a book and start reading the book, we need at least, some of these strategies. The 4 strategies that I mentioned are just the beginning. And these, strategies will continue to develop and evolve as we learn more about the way humans interact with machines, and especially AI systems. So speaking of AI systems, there are 2 different ways to think about, psychologically speaking, 2 different ways to think about AI. There's a symbolic aspect, and then there's an enabling aspect. So AI is at once a kind of a powerful symbol. When you say something is driven by AI, you automatically are invoking all kinds of associations. We call this the machine heuristic. When you say this story was written by an AI, people immediately attribute lots of functions to it, or attributes to it, like it's precise, it's accurate, it's objective, it's neutral, and things like that. And so AI as a symbol has a powerful hold on our psyche and our society. And in general, users tend to attribute decisions made by algorithms to their efficiency and objectivity, which kind of make them appropriate for mechanical tasks, but unfit for human tasks that involve subjective judgments and emotional capabilities. And so users take different stances toward AI. The general idea behind this machine heuristic that I was telling you about is that we trust AI, maybe over trust AI. This is what we call automation bias. It's the tendency to over trust machines and kind of underestimate human acumen in performing the same tasks, resulting in outsourcing and reduced vigilance. And so this has been known in the industrial engineering literature, and is well appreciated, especially in the context of airline pilots. The big Boeing crashes that we had, the 737 MAX crashes a couple of years ago, were attributed to the fact that Boeing or even the airlines did not think it necessary to train pilots because they trusted this automated system so much. But when it failed, when one sensor failed, they did not even have a manual override function that the pilots could use to kind of save the aircraft from crashing. So the symbolic value has powerful consequences, but it also has negative attributions. We can think of AI as also being mechanistic, unyielding, unemotional, cold, transactional, rigid, prone to be hacked. And so some people have experienced this. So if you experience this aircraft crash, or you've heard about this, your attitude toward AI is not one of overtrust, it's maybe undertrust. And this is what we call algorithm aversion. It's a kind of general predisposition to prefer human judgments over algorithmic decisions, even though it is suboptimal. So we have this, again, a tension between how we look at AI, both in a positive and in a negative way. And so in the HCI domain, there's been all this effort to create better AXs. AX stands for algorithmic experience, in terms of being more transparent about how the algorithm is building your profile, and how it's managing your profile, and also the degree to which the user understands how the algorithm works, and the degree to which the user is given control over the algorithm, and also the extent to which the algorithm keeps your information and uses it for future service delivery and so forth. So these are some principles that are becoming more common in AI systems and in interfaces to afford better algorithmic experience. And so embedding cues for promoting trust has become a very big preoccupation with HCI or interface designers. So one of our studies, for example, found that just by framing the AI as a help seeker instead of as a help provider can make a difference to trust. People trust an AI more when it honestly comes out and says, hey, I need your help in order for me to do better, instead of saying, look, I can help you if you give me your data, kind of thing, which is the standard paternalistic way of handling human AI interaction, at least among some of the interfaces that are very common, like YouTube will tell you that it can only help you if you remain in the system and retain your data in the system. And as it turns out, that's not going to breed more trust. Instead, what's going to breed more trust, especially among power users, people who know better, is an AI system that seeks your help. So cues have profound value, but also collaboration matters. The enabling aspect of AI, where the AI enables certain actions on the part of the user, can help user kind of assert control, and there could be good trade-offs and control between the system and the user, so that there's more human involvement in the decision making. There's more of a social exchange where the user feels like that they are exchanging their information for something that is of value that they. And that way, what we'll end up doing is mutually augmenting each other. The AI as a decision aid can augment humans, and then humans with more and more of their data helping the AI become better, can ground truth the system better, can augment AI system to improve itself. So these two aspects, the symbolic aspect and the enabling aspect, are the primary mechanisms of a model that I came up with a couple of years ago called the high time model, which stands for human AI interaction from the perspective of the theory of interactive media effects. That's what time stands for. And as you can see, the affordances of AI media can manifest themselves on the interface, and they can have certain algorithmic attributes which are all cues, and those cues will trigger these quick heuristics or mental rules of thumb, like machine heuristic that I described, and like that there are dozens of heuristics, and in part they are moderated by prior experience, and that indeed leads to how you perceive the AI medium and how much you trust it. The affordances can also enable interactive action and give you more agency and enhance the social exchange and mutual augmentation. And this is the much more engaged way of interacting with AI medium, and that also leads to better user experience and trust. And action route, this latter route, is where you see human AI collaboration, and that's where you can see that there's much more effects because agency there is negotiable, and all kinds of tools of AI like social robots, online chatbots, or smart speakers are all about that collaboration between you and the system. And so there are costs, of course. You have to work hard at sometimes. You have to search for things. You have to choose your settings. But then the benefits are you get better service, more tailored content, and more convenience. And so in that way, action route is the best way to kind of achieve human-machine synergy. The more relational smart technology is, the more there's mutuality and interdependence, leading to kind of a tightly coupled collaboration where the AI is augmenting humans and humans are augmenting AI. And this kind of human-machine synergy is fundamentally based on mutual augmentation, the trade-off of human and machine agency, the social exchange between the user and the medium, or even simply interactivity. All of these enhance user engagement, whereby you can have both user agency and machine agency to have a healthy user experience at the end of the day. And our recent studies have kind of tested these two different routes. So one study that we presented at our annual conference, the International Communication Association conference last year, was about content moderation system, which basically is a system that would moderate and detect if there's hate speech in your Twitter feed. And we had in one condition an AI moderating the content, in another condition it was a human, and in a third condition it was a collaborative effort between AI and human moderators. And we found that the trust is highly dependent on the kind of heuristic that it's triggered, whether it's a machine heuristic that's positive or machine heuristic that's negative. In some people, the different sources of moderation triggered a positive heuristic. In some, it triggered a negative heuristic. And depending on that, the trust is high or low, respectively. But action route, what we did here is we basically, instead of just simply providing transparency about how the system decides what is hate speech or not, we gave them the opportunity to change the way the system makes decisions by saying these keywords are important, these keywords are not important for determining if something is hate speech. And when people had that potential to interactively work with the system, they felt greater agency, and that eventually enhanced their trust. So AI affordances come in many forms. Personalization is something that I discussed today, but there's also conversation, like Alexa essentially affords conversation. We all know lots of machine learning classification problems. And of course, fundamentally, AI affords automation, making things more automated and streamlined. And so these, classifications, these different affordances can convey transparency or expectations. So personalization, for example, by telling you whether it's collaborative filtering or content-based filtering in the algorithm type, it can convey transparency. Alexa, by being anthropomorphic, can raise expectations. A classification system can tell you where the training data came from. That could be an algorithmic attribute that can help you decide whether it's a fair algorithm or not. And then automation, if you say that this story was written by automated journalism, you can convey, whether it's accurate information or not. And so in this way, all of these things in some ways are governed by our prior user, experiences, our privacy concerns, our automation bias, or algorithm aversion. All of these come together too to kind of give you a grand model where the AI affordances through the interface cues affects our trust, moderated by prior user experience. And so in order for us to have more responsive AI, we need to provide more interactivity. We need to have systems that talk to users and seek their feedback and give them more control. And that, in essence, is the fundamental goal of this high time model. And ultimately, the key contributors to credibility of any AI technology is that we have to recognize that user experience is important and trust is a natural offshoot of that. And what algorithms symbolize is very important, consequential, and the degree to which they allow for collaboration is also important, and the degree to which there's possibility for agency negotiation, that is very critical for trustworthy computing and especially trustworthy AI in the future. So with those words, let me stop here and thank you for your attention, and we'll be happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Shyam. I see some applause coming in from people in the audience. Very interesting presentation. I think we do have some time still for questions. So if anyone wants to shoot, you can use the chat function or raise your hand. Yes, Professor Bodo.
Is it me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Shyam, for this super interesting and empirically well-grounded talk. I won't address the actual research that you've done because I don't have anything to add to that. But I would like to ask about the wider context in which these questions are being asked and answered. So one of the questions I have is whether if I understood correctly, that you actually start from this assumption that AI can and should be trusted. And I was wondering whether that's true, and why do you think that an unknown technology with very little history and with lots of bad experiences is treated as above all trustworthy? The second, I really like this idea of co-evolution of human users and AI systems, but I wonder whether you've thought about how this unpaid labor is then being appropriated by private companies. And we have seen that with Google CAPTCHAs, right? And the pushback of Google CAPTCHAs as we train their AI systems for free. So I wonder whether you can situate your discussion or your findings in these wider debates in society about who captures value out of unpaid labor and why trust AI in the first place.
Sure, yeah, thank you for your questions. I do think that trust as a variable is inherent in our consideration of pretty much any system. So even if it's a microwave oven, or even if it's a wristwatch, we have to trust that to perform in a way that is reliable. So ultimately, trust is about reliability, and our tendency to adopt any machine will be determined quite a bit by our tendency to trust or distrust that machine. And so because the theme of today's symposium is about trust, and I do think that trust is an important aspect of any technology, I think it's a natural fit. However, with AI, there's this pretension, if you will, of it taking on some of the intelligence that humans have historically held, and it assumes that intelligence. So in some ways, when we are meeting other humans too, we go through this trust building process. So even with human interaction, we are constantly going through this calculus of whether I can trust this person. Is that person trustworthy? And so even in human affairs, it becomes an important variable. And so from both perspectives, both from the fact that it's a machine and from the fact that it's a human-like machine, I think trust is an important starting point for us to begin this engagement with this technology. Otherwise, we would not be allowing this technology to enter our lives. As far as unpaid labor is concerned, in many ways, this goes back to this notion of the augmentation issue. The degree to which there is value that is given back to the users or to humans in general by these systems is kind of the price you pay, if you will, for this unpaid labor. So if indeed the Googles of the world are using unpaid labor for their own private profit making without any obvious benefit to the end user, then that is certainly problematic. And in fact, that's where I think a communication function is critical, how this actually provides value to users. And I think that value proposition is somewhat underplayed in popular discourse. And that's why, we have this general distrust toward, these technology companies like Google.
Thanks for your question and the answer, Shyam, as well. We have another question, I think, from Bjorn Plezen. He was raising his hand, yeah.
Yeah, one thing I've noticed, and this makes a lot of sense actually coming from the private sector, so this is not criticism by any means, is that you take a very user-centric approach in a sense, right? This how to generate trust among users, what do pre-existing attitudes mean in the context of users. And I think one of the questions in the chat already approaches that kind of in a sense as well. In the public sector, we're of course in a unique situation that, well, not unique, the private sector to some degree also has it, that some AI actually is used directly by citizens and stakeholders or employees. There's also all sorts of applications that are not really used by citizens, but either they're adversaries of the decisions that are taken against them, or they're complete bystanders, spectators that are still relevant through the democratic process. And I was just wondering, do you have an opinion on how that alters maybe the theoretical model that you've established, or whether you think that would remain the same? I'll also say a little bit about it in my presentation, but yeah, just wondering what your opinion is about that.
About, you mean users as kind of bystanders rather than actual participants, you mean? Yeah, so this is actually the central thesis of my action route of my model, where you involve users. In the queue route, you're just providing cues for users, but in the action route, you're encouraging not just human agency in the abstract sense of there having been human-built rules in training the algorithm, but rather human agency in terms of giving users agency, the users to interact, users to have the ability to augment the system with their own individual ground truth. So in that respect, the user is no longer a bystander, but an active co-creator of this AI experience.
Thanks again. We have one final question I'm going to allow in the chat before we move along to the first panel presentation. So a question from Mayara Marinho, who wants to know your opinion about how trusting AI in private organizations can be different from trusting AI when governments use it. So the difference, whether it's a government or a...
Sure, yeah. So when private organizations use it, we call it tracking. When governments use it, we call it surveillance. Of course, now recently, as you might know, Shoshana Zuboff came up with this book about surveillance capitalism, which kind of combines the two. It conflates the corporate kind of tracking with the government kind of surveillance. And so the source of the algorithm is an important cue. And so I didn't talk about this in my talk, but where I would situate this is part of the interface manifestation of AI. If the AI is a government agency, like the WHO or the CDC or whatever, you have a different stance toward it than if it is a private entity or a corporate entity like Pfizer or Moderna. And so in that case, you know how to factor that in because you know something about the motivations of these government agencies compared to these private pharmaceutical companies. And likewise, there are different levels of government agency. There's CIA and there's the Secret Service agencies and so forth, which we trust less compared to maybe government agencies that are more health oriented or public health oriented. And so that's where I think our personal equations with credibility comes in. And that's why it's important for AI interfaces to have those cues present. Who's tracking you? Who's collecting what kind of information? And this goes back to the algorithmic transparency that I was telling you earlier about in my talk.